Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, conducts olfactory sensation, which is a sensory special sense, to the brain. Its receptors, which are bipolar neurons, are in the olfactory mucosa of the nasal cavity. It then travels through the cribriform foramina of the ethmoid bone and synapses in the olfactory bulbs, which are located in the anterior cranial fossa. Within the olfactory bulb, the axons synapse with a smaller number of neurons, the axons of which form the olfactory tract and project to the olfactory cortex. Damage to the olfactory nerve can cause partial or complete loss of smell. Cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, is a sensory nerve of vision, which is a sensory special sense that is an outgrowth of the brain. It originates in the retina of the eye, then enters the cranium via the optic canal of the sphenoid bone. The left and right optic nerves unite at the optic chiasm, and the optic tract then travels to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Finally, information is forwarded to the occipital lobe. Damage to the optic nerve can cause visual defects.
Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, has the function of innervating upper eyelid muscles and 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. In fact, its somatic motor function is to supply the superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique muscles. Those all move the eye. Another aspect of the somatic motor function is to supply the levator palpebrae superioris muscle to elevate the eyelids. Contrastly, cranial nerve 3's parasympathetic motor function is to innervate sphincter pupillae muscle of the iris to make pupils constrict and contract the ciliary muscles of the lens of the eye to make them more spherical, which helps with near visual acuity, or NVA. The oculomotor nerve leaves the cranium via the superior orbital fissure and travels to the eye and eyelid. Nerve damage of the cranial nerve 3 could cause ptosis, diplopia, and focusing difficulties. Next is cranial nerve 4, also known as the trochlear nerve. This has the function of innervating only one extrinsic eye muscle, the superior oblique. This loops through a pulley-shaped ligament. Its somatic motor function is to supply this muscle, which helps move the eye inferiorly and laterally. Cranial nerve 4 leaves the cranium via the superior orbital fissure and travels to the superior oblique muscle. Nerve damage of cranial nerve 4 could cause paralysis of this superior oblique muscle, which could lead to strabismus and diplopia.
Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, is the largest cranial nerve and has 3 divisions: the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. All 3 divisions have sensory functions, but only the mandibular nerve has a motor function as well. More specifically, the ophthalmic nerve innervates the skin and mucous membrane of the area highlighted in green, while the maxillary nerve innervates the skin, mucous membranes, and sinuses of the area highlighted in blue. Finally, the mandibular nerve innervates the skin, mucous membrane, and striated muscle of the area highlighted in orange. In addition to its sensory function, however, the mandibular nerve also allows for motor functions, such as mastication, since it innervates the muscles involved in this process. The 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve all exit the skull through different openings, with the ophthalmic nerve exiting via the superior orbital fissure, as indicated by the letter A on figure 7.9, the maxillary nerve exiting through the foramen rotundum, as indicated by B on the figure, and the mandibular nerve exiting via the foramen ovale, as indicated by C on the figure. Cranial nerve 6, also known as the abducens nerve, has only a motor function. It innervates the lateral rectus muscle of the eye, which works to abduct the eyeball, allowing the eyeball to rotate the gaze away from midline. The abducens nerve exits the cranium and enters the orbit of the eye through the superior orbital fissure, as indicated by A on the figure.
Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, has sensory and motor functions. It receives taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the palate, general sensation from a small area of skin of the auricle of the ear. It is responsible for the secretion of saliva through the submandibular and sublingual glands and secretion of mucus in the nasal cavity. Also responsible for secretion of tears through the lacrimal gland. Motor function of the facial nerve includes innervation of facial muscles, posterior belly of digastric muscles, styloid, and stapedius. The motor neurons of the nerve enter the skull through the internal acoustic meatus and exit the skull through the stylomastoid foramen, as indicated on the figure. Cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, only has sensory function. The two main functions of this nerve are hearing through the innervation of the cochlea and balance through innervation of semicircular canals and vestibule. The vestibulocochlear nerve enters the skull through the internal acoustic meatus, as indicated on the figure.
Cranial nerve 9, also known as the glossopharyngeal nerve, has both sensory and motor functions. It receives taste and touch sensations from the posterior one-third of the tongue, general sensation to most of the pharynx, and sensation to chemoreceptor axons to carotid bodies. Carotid bodies are the structures on carotid arteries that detect and monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Motor functions include innervation of the stylopharyngeus of the pharynx muscle and secretion of the parotid salivary gland. This nerve passes through the jugular foramen. Cranial nerve 10, also known as the vagus nerve, has both sensory and motor functions. It receives visceral sensory information from the heart, lungs, and most of the abdominal organs, and general sensory information from the external acoustic meatus, eardrum, laryngopharynx, and larynx. Motor functions include innervation of most of the pharynx and larynx muscles, and innervation of visceral smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands of the heart, lungs, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and most of the abdominal organs. This nerve passes through the jugular foramen.
To conclude this video, we will talk about cranial nerve 11, which is the spinal accessory nerve, and cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. First, the somatic motor function of the spinal accessory nerve, or cranial nerve 11, is to supply the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. As you may recall from Unit 2, the sternocleidomastoid muscles and serves as an important role in rotating the head, while the trapezius muscle plays an important role in moving the scapula. The spinal accessory nerve enters through the foramen magnum in the skull and exits through the jugular foramen, indicated in the figure on the right. Lastly, the hypoglossal nerve, or cranial nerve 12, has an entirely somatic motor function. It is involved in controlling movements of the tongue that are necessary for speech and swallowing. The hypoglossal nerve travels through the hypoglossal canal in the skull, which is labeled in the figure on the right.